everyone. Hello. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Grace Law. I am professor and chair of the Department of Architecture here at the GSD and principal of law Dolman. It's great to see all of you this evening. Tonight marks the 6th John Hejduk Soundings Lecture, an annual event honoring the legacy of John Q. Hejduk, Harvard GSD M.Arch, class of 1953. Before we begin, I would like to thank those who have made this year's Hejduk Lectureship possible through their generosity. I would also like to thank Swissnex, a co-sponsor of this event with the Architecture Department, and we're very, very grateful for all the support in making this opportunity possible. I'm delighted to introduce Jacques Herzog, co-founder of the Swiss practice Herzog de Meuron, who hardly needs an introduction. He returns to us as a former faculty member and a longtime friend of the GSD. When we hear his name, or the name of his eponymous firm, many notable buildings immediately come to mind. The Tate Modern in London, the Bird's Nest National Stadium for the Beijing Olympics, or perhaps an older, more intimate project such as the flickering copper-clad signal box in Basel of the late 1990s. The common thread running through these projects and many others is something less easily named, but I will try. A way that Herzog's buildings hold in suspension matter, perception, and atmosphere. In 1978, Herzog de Meuron emerged with an architectural vision at some distance from both postmodern quotation and high-tech spectacle. Early commissions became laboratories for a kind of realism that returned to the scale of the senses, making simple figures carry unexpected intensity. Just over a decade later, in 1989, Jacques and Pierre came to the GSD as visiting professors. Then, returning from 1994 through 2014, bringing this ever-evolving project into conversation with our students and faculty. In their 2001 Pritzker Laureate acceptance speech, they described their time at Harvard as a critical step before some of their most ambitious work on the global stage. Jacques' time at the GSD overlapped with the rise of digital representation and more intricate systems of execution as drawing, modeling, and building were reorganized by software and globalized production. The option studios that he offered with Pierre asked how these tools could tighten the link between design and making, but also how to work within an industrial building culture increasingly detached from craft while still producing material presence. This question has endured in their work across scales, programs, and context. Their practice treating architecture as a field of phenomena that are encountered before being intellectually registered. That affective ambition is matched by a commitment toward process and the meticulous archiving of that process, insisting that the life of a project includes all of the artifacts of its trial assemblies, mock-ups, and samples. One-to-one fragments are treated as primary sites of authorship rather than an incidental means to an end. In an image economy structured around the rapid production and consumption of finished and final architectural images, this insistence on laying things out on the table, as Jacques put it here in his 2011 lecture, like ingredients in a kitchen, keeps judgment, disagreement, and discovery active inside a large contemporary practice. What finally gets built retains a palpable residue of thought. Today, Herzog de Meuron's portfolio spans more than 600 projects in over 40 countries. In the quarter century since their crowning achievement of being awarded the Pritzker Prize, Herzog de Meuron's work has been recognized by many other major international honors, including the RIBA Royal Gold Medal, the Mies van der Rohe Award, and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Medal. Yet from the outset, the office has been driven less by a recognizable style than by a set of evolving questions. We have decided to discuss a few of these this evening in lieu of a formal lecture. Our conversation will focus on 3 themes, each grounded in specific projects. First, we will discuss time and appearance through examples of the Ricola Mulhouse and the M+. Second, we will discuss the question of materiality and what Jacques calls the hidden geometry of nature, as explored in the Dominus Winery and the Schaulager. And third, the relationship between authorship and process, for which we will discuss the Elbphilharmonie and the Calder Gardens. Because the discipline is under increasing pressure to operate in response to capital, carbon metrics, value engineering, and procurement risk, these 3 themes feel especially relevant now. They direct attention to the primacy of sensation and the force of artistic will that underpin the unique spatial experiences manifested in the work of Herzog and de Meuron. For many of us in this room, the Herzog and de Meuron projects are already familiar. So tonight is a chance to delve into the ideas that animate them and which continue to inspire us. I am sure that we will all enjoy returning to our shared and ongoing inquiries. Jacques, it is a real pleasure to have you back at the GSD. Please join me in welcoming Jacques Herzog. And what is also very interesting about this particular strange format is I told Jacques, don't worry, it's just you and me. We're in a room and, pretend that nobody is here. But I think a lot of people are here, so this is a lot. But as best we can, I hope that we can just have a really intimate, honest, intuitive conversation. I do have some questions prepared, but I thought that it would be a great opportunity, in fact, for us to, again, as much as we can, pretend nobody is here. So let's begin a little bit with time and appearance. I'll just say that Jacques and I have been in a kind of weird email conversation where I've lobbed something over the email and he lobbed something back at me. So we've been in this kind of very loose conversation. But it's been quite interesting because we thought that there are 2 projects that could be used to describe or to talk about the question of time and appearance. The first project will be the Ricola Mulhouse, which was a 1993 project, a storage facility in France. And then we will then move to the M+ project, which is in Hong Kong, a cultural center. But maybe I'd just start seeding this conversation by saying that since your early days, it's been clear that you've been interested in changing appearances, the changing appearances of architectural form, and as a result, the kind of idea of individual perception. And as we know, complex architectural form can trigger creative perception by the viewer. And so I thought maybe we could just talk a little bit about, of course, what we're beginning to see right now, the Ricola project. And in particular, tell us a little bit about how that facade is operating and what you were thinking about through this condition of screen printing.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Grace, for having me here, and thank you all for coming. It's really touching for me to be back, and physically nothing has changed. I mean, architecturally, everything, also the hotel I stay, the Charles, everything looks exactly like. But
you should see our couches.
But obviously the world has changed dramatically. And I say this because when we look back to the Ricola thing, and even M+, which is already a few years ago, architecture reflects very much the time in which it is built, the time where I, Pierre, whoever was involved in a project, were different people, and architecture doesn't change, really. Architecture stays, if I go back to the Ricola building, it's still the same, it doesn't have a soul or a mind like we humans have, and that's why we change. Whereas buildings only physically change in that you see stains of aging, traces of aging. And we always loved, and I think the Ricola is a good example for this. We loved to use this passing of time as an ingredient to create architecture. The Ricola building has the silkscreen printed facade, which obviously is the main feature. I was personally always interested in silkscreen printing and in repetitive figuration and the question of figurative versus abstract. And you can see in these images that it's very paradox. You know, it's this glass facade, it's polycarbonate. When there's no light, seems to be totally opaque, totally. Whereas the concrete facade that you see now is really opaque, but seems to be transparent, mirror. Water is like mirror. The water that runs down is an active agent of our design. And if you go back now, there is moss and water transforming this concrete wall in a much more lively and transparent element, whereas the polycarbonate facade, if there is no one there, if there is no light there, is just dead. You know, so we like to use obvious physical givens to inspire buildings, to make them different. And making a building different, finding a way to make architecture specific, something that we didn't know before we did the design, was from the beginning something we wanted to do, because we didn't like anything that was being done at that time. We didn't like the architecture when we started in the 70s and early 80s. Well, and that's why, for instance, this silkscreen facade, you know, was something that the client allowed us to do. And that's when I say the time was different. I don't think that now, today, you would so easily find a client for an industrial building to let you do something like this. So many things come together when we talk about architecture. It always involves the time in which we live. And the time obviously changes things, and the topic, appearance and time, is a very important ingredient of all we do.
So I'd like to know a little bit more about that, because in the Ricola, of course, it's a storage building in essence, and in some ways it epitomizes the shed. It is a shed.
Absolutely.
And it's hard not to recall the argument about the duck versus the decorated shed in this condition. And there have been some who had said that, well, in a case like this, this is neither the duck nor the decorated shed, but the decorated duck. And and I think in that kind of a commentary, perhaps there is some acknowledgement that the rigidity of modernist language at that time, and that you were thinking about, was not enough. And so trying to make a kind of corporal presence with this translucency.
I think that's a very, very interesting argument you make here. Decorated shed is Venturi. That's hardcore pop, you know. A duck is a duck, and this means something. This here is using pop art technology, which is Warhol used this a lot, but it's not pop art, you know. It has a more, like natural history, it has a more magic, mysterious character. And that's what makes it different from the decorated shed, you know. It's not, it doesn't want to say something, you know, like advertising. Advertising says smoke Marlboro. This is not saying consume this herb, it's sweet, it's nice, it's attractive. It's something totally different. It's like a forest, or you know, and this is like a piece of nature. You know, this wall is the wall with water is perhaps more natural than what suggests to be nature. This printed leaf. So it raises, or it rises all these questions come up. You know, that's the difference to Venturi's approach to architecture.
So, but in this case, the actual imagery is a silkscreen. And it has a kind of, it's almost a version of a fleur-de-lis of some, you know, and of course it does remind one of the herbs that we know are the essence of Ricola products. And so just to understand a little bit more about that, Did you propose that image, or how did that image rise to the occasion?
Yeah, of course, that was a reason to say, hey, it has dried herbs in this storage. By the way, the form is just generic, you know, it's just a box that you open. So the form is not really a topic. It's really about all these surfaces, this kind of question of appearances. And so the client likes it, and the client, the owners, are very there's an art affinity in their whole family, so they let us do whatever we wanted to do. I mean, not really, but every single building we've done for them is very different, and it tries different things. And the herb was the beginning, but at the end of the day, the herb, the leaf, is not really in the foreground. I used the photograph of Blosfeld. Blosfeld is a photographer, famous photographer, German photographer of the early 20th century. And the interesting thing is that he uses photography to photograph natural objects, but in a very abstract way. When this leaf is so beautiful because it's natural, it's very refined, but it's very abstract. This was a previous attempt to do something which was more like almost like a drawing. So we tried several things before we ended up with this floral pattern. And the interesting thing, another interesting thing, is that's why this slide is interesting. You see the man, when they mounted these panels, what is the size? You know, this is also about, in pop art, what is the size of a scissors, or the size of the face of Marilyn? You know, and in this case, because it's architecture, the size needed to be more or less the size of a human. So the leaf, this plant, if you stand in front of it, that's different from looking at it on a slide wall. Speaks to you immediately. You know, if the leaf is this size and you are in front of this leaf, it's just like a tile in your bathroom. It's ridiculous. But as soon as you grow it to a certain size, it's just right to seduce you, to suck you in almost. And if it's too big, it's scary. So it has many, many details which make this, let's say, different from just a decoration, you know.
So that scale is going to come up, I think, a lot in this conversation, because, in fact, the way in which nature has been scaled in many of the projects that you've done, we'll actually be talking about that again later, so I'd like to definitely return to that. But in terms of the artistic influence, you know, when I was looking at this project, I was seeing, obviously, like Donald Judd in the simplicity of the box. I was seeing the Andy Warhol reference in the silk screening. And in many ways, I was wondering, okay, so is this possible partly because the program is inert? You're not responding, you're able to, some refer to it in maybe perhaps a slightly derogatory way as a tattooing of the building. But I think you were trying to do something else to make that material speak. It is a polycarbonate.
Yeah, it's a very inexpensive material. That's another thing that I like about this building. If you took this and made it into a luxurious, refined design, maybe it would be stupid. It works well the way it is. So the material in which we print this leaf produces this kind of, on this slide you can see this kind of seemingly opaque surface. And here we are back to this question of appearance, because nothing is what it seems to be. You know, and especially nature is also like this. I mean, nature, the surface of water is so changing. This is so interesting. If you just watch the surface of a lake or of a river, how much it can change. Sometimes it looks like metal, like lead, you know.
Yeah.
Or like sometimes it's very transparent.
So,
and the same is with, or can be with architectural objects.
But it seems like in the Ricola project, clearly you're working with the, let's say, the diurnal rhythm, day to night, to have that material change in its appearance. So if we fast forward by 3 decades, maybe we can turn a bit to the M+ project, because now we're looking at this question of time and appearance. And when we think about M+, there seems to be a kind of long arc in the work in which Now the facade moves to carry other kinds of graphic imagery, of course, to become a very public facade. And here, just to orient everyone to this project, this is a project from 2021 at the M+, a cultural center in Hong Kong. And so I thought this was a very interesting bracketing of this particular fascination with time and perception and appearance, because of course, over the 3 decades, of course, the technology has also changed. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
I also think this is a very good example in that context. First of all, this building starts with a very physical component, and its DNA is very Hong Kong. It sits on top of a tunnel, the train tunnel connecting the airport with Hong Kong. And so we had to build this over this train tunnel, and you can see it on this slide. It's a competition-based project, and our competitors wanted to avoid this tunnel, and that was also in the brief. Hey, take care, there's a tunnel underneath, so you have to somehow bridge over, find a way. And we sort of said, we want to use this as like an archaeological element. And obviously it's very physical, you know, you can see this hardcore concrete structure. So the building sits on that, and we excavate this underground, which at the same time creates a kind of a world, an underworld, where artists have a more experimental laboratory kind of gallery type. So we can, as if it's a fake found space, you know, it was found, but a fake because we excavated, we created as if we found it. And as we know, many museums today are longing for such spaces which are a bit awkward, which are a bit industrial, which are raw, which are not the refined gallery, which we also did in this building. But it was like we built the building on this physical component. You see this kind of labyrinthic quality that was given for free, because I didn't want to shape this myself. I don't like to shape things proactively. I like to look what is, and then sometimes you just find it. Sometimes the most interesting things are just there. We just don't see them very often. And so that's how it starts. And then we have this very large plinth, which seems to hover above this underground. And the same is being tilted up like a slab. So we have these very different but very simple elements that compose this, make this building. And the vertical one, which stands out from that ground, is a kind of a screen, like a TV. And this was also very early in the process, that screen, because the screen is like a face towards Hong Kong on the other side of the bay. And the interesting thing of this screen is it's such a strong physical object, but in that we insert these LED lines in between these tiles, we transform this very physical object in something totally immaterial. And this is especially interesting in that context of Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has this forest of high-rise and mostly commercial buildings, and it's also even more interesting to do this in that context, because the high-rise we do and the possibility of these LED screens is like a kind of a piracy, you know, like artists invade the business world, the business silhouette, to make it theirs. And it's you can see this on this slide.
So this picture was especially startling to me, and
exactly for this reason, it's being swallowed by the rest, even if it's so powerful, and vice versa. It's also using the background to say, hey, this is a different message, this is a strange message, this immaterial, these kind of projections that pop up. You can see this, I think, in the next slide. These artists really are so magic, and they are transforming this otherwise very commercial skyline in something very different.
So-
It also has, by the way, I think, a very interesting political message, because it's art, it's not obviously political, but it's a subversive political message in an otherwise very commercially dominated skyline.
So let's unpack that a little bit more, because I'll be honest, the first time I saw this project, and I didn't see this particular set of images. I only saw, let's say, an image of it in the daytime as a kind of plinth and slab building. And when I first saw it, I said, what's going on there? And then I saw the digital image pop up, and I thought to myself, oh no, has the building become the billboard, literally? And what does that mean? But then as I was studying this project further, I realized that there's actually something really fascinating about the way in which one can occupy that billboard, if you will, that large digital screen, so all of a sudden there's a kind of thickness of space in the digital screen. And I thought to myself, okay, so there's something actually beautiful and humane about that particular moment. But then the other side of me said, you just reference it, it can contain a political message. But on the other hand, it can also contain a kind of it is a sort of commodification of architecture to some degree. What would you say to that if somebody else asked you that?
Well, you can always interpret it this way or that way. As architecture can just offer potentials. It cannot say you have to see it this way or that way. It cannot say you have to use it this or that way. But you should not miss, in no project, even the tiniest one, the inherent potential that is given to you as an architect. Whether it's the place where it is, whether it's the program, whatever. And times may change, and the building will be used perhaps in a different way someday, but it has this potential to speak to people, and it has the potential to be invaded by others than me, or Herzog de Meuron, because many artists have been using this screen and have been transforming this building in something theirs, and that's another aspect which I like about this project. The transformation of this different appearance is not just happening, but it can be occupied by other people. Not by the architect.
I think that's what was so interesting, is that as one read into it more, you could see that there was a kind of collective potential with the digital screen that has in some ways not only reciprocity with the city, but reciprocity with the institution in declaring itself, and then of course with the artists themselves. So I thought that there was definitely some kind of suggestion of an authorship beyond the architect, and for the life of the building afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's important. And when I was there last time and different artists' videos were popping up, it was very touching for me. I really, because I didn't know how I would feel if I see my building or our building being invaded by someone else and make it a totally different thing. Because at night, you can see this on one of these slides, it literally is not that physical building anymore. That's why I started this kind of part of the conversation with saying what is underneath, and that it's so physical and so powerful and so generous and grand. And I like this paradox. I think paradox is the ultimate aspect of something seductive and something interesting in architecture. Because it seems so, but in fact it is different. Or you look at this and it seems so fragile and so, but at the same time, it's when you can touch it. You can, you can almost, it's like this Hansel and Gretel thing, this seductive building that you like to touch and almost eat. I don't say you can eat this building, but when you're there, you will see there are many areas, many corners, which have a very, how do you say this, tactile quality.
So I think this is an interesting segue because we're going to talk about seduction. I like this. Maybe we can go to the next theme, just because I want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about a lot of the projects here. And I think seduction is actually at the underpinning of the next theme, which is materiality. You have referred to materiality as an attempt to understand or uncover the hidden geometry of nature. And I'd like, just for our audience, to recognize that geometry here, I mean, we often use the word geometry, and we are often thinking of very specific mathematical meaning of geometry that focuses on the relationships of points, lines, angles, surfaces, planes, solids, etc. But I think, Jacques, you're using the word geometry in the ancient Greek sense, literally meaning to measure the earth. And here, materials have inherent properties. So for you, a kind of hidden order or a hidden essence, a metaphysical sense, if you will. And you've described searching for the kind of spiritual principle and not primarily the outer appearance of nature to, in a sense, unearth the project. So this conversation might ask if nature is neither nostalgic image mimicry nor the pursuit of, let's say, a scientific principle, how can architecture bind nature and artifice into some kind of legible relationship? How can architecture make felt rather than merely pictured within an image economy that prioritizes instant legibility? So where meaning is expected to register immediately before material processes or constructional judgment. We're going to be discussing two projects here. Here, the Dominus Winery, which is in Napa, California. It's a winery and vineyard project. And then that's from 1998. And then we will also talk about the Schaulager, which is the art storage project in Basel. So tell us this, and by the way, the hidden geometry of nature, that came up in one of your very, very early lectures here as well. So I'd like to draw that, bring it forward.
I think that Dominus Winery is a good example for this topic. The stone that we ultimately used as a main material, this is a mock-up we did in our garden in Basel. You see two formats, the smaller ones, which are filled into these gabions, and the larger ones, which are too big, actually, so they produce a gap. But we come back to this later. We also, it was really new to use gabions as a building material. Normally, it just was used in landscape, but it. Again, we had a great client, Christian Wex, and they let us do this, and it's still very fresh when you go back there. So it's physically stands up, and you can see this is an image when we built it. So it has these three components. It has the gabions, which are metal, and this is an important image because the metal is almost more important than the stone if you look from the side, and the sun hits this metal, so it has a very bronze-like appearance. And if you look frontally against it from outside, then it's just stupid stones. And if you look from inside, like here, it's just magic. And coming back to nature and geometry and hidden ingredients and things, if you just have a stone, normally architects select stone because they like their surface, they prefer this marble against this marble. Here we just use the gravel that was found in this volcanic landscape. And so the in-between space between the stones is as important as the stone itself. So we use both the form. You can see this is a stupid attempt, right? And then we just threw them into the gabions and found it much more interesting than if we piled them up correctly. Why? Because when we just throw them inside, then we create different gaps between the stones. And then we found out when we use larger stones, the gaps are not filled out, so they leave space in between, which create this kind of image of the difference. So there's no decoration, there's no imagery. It's just the stones do that, And we hadn't never, this is like lace, but it's solid stones and thick stones. So we have this paradox impression when you walk through this gate that you have this very strong, very powerful stone wall, and when you walk through the gate, then all of a sudden you see the backside, and you just see the in-between spaces, and the shape that you see is rather the in-between space than the stone itself. And ultimately, yes, it works for the client because the fat stones, keep the heat out of the building. And it's an old joke I make, but they never used the air condition, to cool the thing because it was not needed. They could have saved $1 million. But that's also why stone, stone is a material that has been used since thousands of years, exactly for that, and this climate in California is very ideal because it's very hot during the day and can be cool in the evening, which is perfect for wine storage. So that's the story briefly told, but it was a long way to discover that. We didn't know that. It's not based on knowing, but it's based, like many things we do, on experimenting, on the spark and an idea, but then, we discovered other things.
So when did the choice for this idea for the gabion wall and how early was that? Did you find the stone and look at these and say, these are dumb stones?
No, we've done, I should see the archives. There are many drawings. The building had a shape. It was more shape-based, but whenever we try to avoid shape, form in architecture, and let it happen. And here, this rectangular form was more, in line, literally spoken, to the different sequences of the production, collecting the grapes, then the tank room, then the storage, and then the archive, and et cetera, et cetera. And the upper floor, I also like this image where the glass wall becomes a projection wall of this light, playfulness with the light. But I think the hidden geometry, is also visible there. The materials can do more than just be nice, and decorative. And when you see this building in the nature, because the stones are from there, and even if it sits in the center, in the middle of the field of the vineyard, the building is like a stealth bomber. You can hardly see it because somehow the color of the stone and the color of the landscape, even if it's planted, it almost disappears. And at night, it has these subtle transparencies, which and this moment when the sun fades away, it again has a different appearance. So this chapter is connected to the first one, even if here we talk about materials.
Yes, it seems that way because in both the Ricola project and in this one, it seems like you are binding together things that we wouldn't necessarily see as being together. For example, heavy and light at the same time, transparent and opaque at the same time.
Maybe you asked me about the hidden geometry. That was really an early text when I was very interested in also other aspects than, let's say, the way, for instance, copper is used in architecture is just a technical use. But especially Beuys, who's an artist who has inspired us early in our career, for him this was a feminine material, whereas iron was a male material, and because of this kind of energy flow that copper can have or has, and we used it also proactively for the signal box that you mentioned, because of course, the wrapping of the copper keeps how do you call this? Electric. It's like I forgot the name.
It's acting as a conduit for this.
Exactly. No, but it keeps any radiation from outside out of the building because it wraps around, and copper does this better than any other, than steel, for instance. So I think it's interesting to look what else can a material do than just being used in a purely functional way or an aesthetic way.
And I think that's it. what you have done in this particular project, the transformation from this thing that we see as an inert object into this collection through the gabion, I think is an incredibly interesting transformative condition, which actually, maybe if we turn to the next project, takes that even one step further. In the Schaulager project, again, this is an art storage project in Basel. It was done about 5 years later. And so there are some things that you were thinking about clearly, especially in relationship to materiality, found things, and the way in which it would change your understanding of the site. Tell us a little bit about this, because of course this is on the site, on the quarry of the location.
You can see these images are some of the holdings of the Schaulager. It's an archive, actually. It is the first of its kind. And became very popular in the world of art because museums are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more expensive. So to do a lager, storage, rather than another museum is a brilliant idea the client had, you know. So it's filled with artworks which are not stored in crates where you cannot control them, but they are openly stored in small galleries, spaces like cells, you know, but paintings hang on the wall, objects on the floor or on plinths or pedestals, but more compressed, much more compressed. So you use 5 or 10 times less space for more art. So the fact of storing and protecting is a bit like in the Dominus winery, is very key. And that's why we did the building, which is needed to be a different building type. We have this big atrium from where you see what is in the building. But the building, that's the site. When we dig out the site, this is like a quarry of gravel. This is, Basel sits on the bend of the knee of the Rhine, so most of the area around has amazing gravel grounds, and when you excavate the site, you have the material. And in fact, this is almost like the ideal condition of any building anywhere in the world. When you do a building, just find the material in the ground. So you take the material to build the building from the ground and you don't bring it from wherever. And we could do this much more often. And here, the gravel was being used to build the walls. Ideally, we didn't want to use cement, but the client turned it down because the walls would have been even thicker and slightly inclined, and some gravel would have come down. But it's less cement, and it's especially all the material didn't need to be brought there. So ecologically and sustainability-wise, this is the topic now much more discussed than at that time, but it's an ideal case for that also. And we wanted to expose the material that we use. That's why we scratched off its surface, so you can see it's not like a concrete wall where you don't see what the material is. And for anything else, you can see the surface here. We used this and blew it up. That's a kind of a pop version of the natural surface that you see on these steel doors. And the windows that you see, and also the ceiling, this kind of surface comes from when we had to do some windows, and we sort of didn't like the fact that we used these very special walls and just cut a window in it. But we said a window needs to somehow give some evidence of what that material is. So we also try to find a way to reveal the inherent character of the material. And if you take your finger and you go walk your finger through sand or through gravel, it produces exactly this kind of shape that you see in the windows. So these windows are in fact the traces of an object cutting open this wall. So you can see this here. And the shape which produced this was very easy to do, in that we just were you use this kind of piece of metal and blew it up. Now you can do it with digital technology.
So I had a question about that metal. how did you decide how many crinkles would be in this metal?
Well, we just bumped into this, and we just produced it. It was just exactly how when you do this finger, it depends how you move this finger. There's not one logical form. It's just a type of form that is the result of this movement.
So can I ask about this? Because
like
on
a
the
giant
one hand,
finger that walks.
and it looks like a giant finger, but at the same time, it also has a kind of geologic quality that looks like it is part. It's when there's a fissure in the earth or something like. I mean, it recalls these natural conditions, and yet is not mimicry, but in some ways indexing a kind of nature, if you will. And so, in your mind, what is the difference between an idea about indexing nature and actual mimicry or like a direct representation? Would it have been okay if I had taken that crinkle and that had actually been something else, like from nature, and then scale it up? Or, when is it okay?
Yeah.
How does one determine that?
That's a good point, but there's no clear answer. If it looks stupid, it's mimicry. But if it looks good,
okay. So when it looks, so what defines when something looks stupid?
because we can mock it up, and we can be. When I say I, very often, of course, I have a kind of, like an idea, but we are, like architects, we are quite a few working on the project. So then we come in this kind of question of the process. We look and we are several opinions, and we discuss it, and I think we have enough interior kind of culture of dialogue and of criticism to avoid the most stupid things, ideally.
Okay, so you're speaking in a room of lots of students and faculty, and so there are many people who would say, we know it when we see it. You have a gut feeling, and but we're not allowed to say to the students that looks stupid. We're not allowed to say that.
No, but we are back, Grace. We are back to this question of the flower and the relationship between you as a visitor and the object in front of you, or the window. And I think that's very much architecture. That's why architecture can hardly be judged based on images, because it's really something physical in front of the human, and it's very different if a window is like this or like this or like this. I mean, also in art, in painting, that was a huge gap in art history in the 20th century, when in America abstract expressionism was blowing up the scale all of a sudden. Barnum did these amazing paintings which were forcing you as a viewer to literally walk. It was like very physical, and it could only be invented in a country like America with these amazing landscapes. And Dominus has this panoramic opening, which is an homage to the American landscape. This could not be in Switzerland, in no other country in Europe, because of the scale. So scale is not only to the viewer or to the visitor, but also to the landscape and to the specific culture. So America has a different landscape and you do different buildings, and I think Dominus is very typical. I couldn't say this about Schaulack. I think you could do this also in America, but sometimes this question of is it stupid, does it work, has to do with so many factors that have to be specifically answered in the concrete moment in time and the place.
So getting back to the exterior expression of this, I am kind of curious your views on ornament. The question of ornament in architecture, so many extensive writings on it, and of course, we know that Loos felt that ornament was actually absolutely depraved condition. At the same time, we also realize that ornament today, as we think about it, it can, in some way, it's a systemic. It can be a systemic part of construction that organizes material to create meaning, rather than, let's say, a mask or simply applied surface. What does it mean to you today? Because actually this project in particular, one could say, has a kind of ornament or an idiomatic expression that has to do with some of the things that are natural.
I think that's also a very interesting question, because the term is not very clear, but my understanding of ornament is the opposite of decorative. Ornament and decoration has nothing to do with each other, but they touch each other, you know. I totally am against the stupid text of laws, the racist text of laws about the ornament. If he saw the many people who are tattooed today, he would send everybody to prison. You know, but I think ornament, the way I understand it, is, and I think I don't know whether we see the Trada building in Tokyo, is a holistic understanding of architecture, is the coming together of, let's say, a facade that is not only a facade, but at the same time is defining a space and is defining also the aesthetic of a building and the construction, you know. So it's integrating, as you said before, the whole system of a building. And that it produces what we call ornament. It's a kind of an idea of the whole thing. When you have a box and you just have some images on top, that's more decoration. Except for, like in the case of M+, it's literally penetrating the whole construction. You know, it has a conceptual meaning. Otherwise, it's if it doesn't have this conceptual meaning, it's just advertisement. It's just, you know, poster.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, it seems to me even Loos broke his own rules to some degree, recognizing that some things are more imbued with cultural meaning and or marks of their construction. So that's a very interesting subject. I'm wondering, because we've now been talking about this arc of these questions, I'm also wondering if we should talk about process, because the Schaulager sets us up to, you know, look at all of these ways in which you've manipulated materials and transformed them to become either these kinds of screen surfaces or other things. And I think that really shows up when we think about the relationship of authorship and process. Here we're going to be talking about the Elbphilharmonie, which was a 2016 project, Hamburg Concert Hall. And then we'll also talk about one of a newer project, Calder Gardens, a museum for Alexander Calder, the work of Alexander Calder in Philadelphia. But you have spoken about process, and you've said that it does not replace authorship per se, but that process supports the origin story for each new project. And this opens up, I think, questions about the role of process in authorship and how process can also be a participant or a silent contributor or maybe even a silent author to the project. And in this sense, form is not an origin, but a residue of that process. And maybe using these projects, we can talk about that initial impulse or the spark that you referred to earlier. And maybe you could describe briefly what you mean by spark.
Well, that's relatively easy. It's like sometimes very fast.
You mean like stupid?
No. But in the case of the Elbphilharmonie, I said this many times. When the client came to Basel on the first meeting, he gave me a postcard of this building, and I made a sketch. And this was very similar to how the building came out. So it was like something that obviously was immediately here. God knows why. And all these images show that we then forgot it for a while and we tried many other things, you know, and that's then the process, you know, that we did. We tried to take this first sketch. This first sketch says it has to be this kind of wave-like structure on top of this existing box, you know.
And how did you know, though, that was the right...
And the clients originally said, we have this box, let's do a concert hall in it, you know. And so that was a spontaneous idea. That's what I mean by spark. Sometimes you need something that gets things being started in a direction. You know, if you have a process, but you don't start it with something really, with a kind of an energy, you know, then it goes in the wrong direction. And also during a process, very often it needs other impulses. And because it's architecture and not painting or sculpture where someone alone is doing this thing, it needs always corrections to remain, to find the way to where it should be, you know. But very often, you know, at least at the end, it's a concert hall and it should be on top of this thing. But in another project, like in the case of the Calder, we come back to this one. I didn't know anything, and the client didn't know anything. He didn't give us a brief. He didn't give us there was no zoning, not even a clear, defined space. So that was a very different process. Here, even if it's much bigger, the Elbphilharmonie was clearly limited, you know, and we said it should be on top. But it needed this thing and this spark, as I say, and we very soon did a very seductive image, and that's why it has this article in the newspaper, Wir wollen sie, we want it, because this image of this object on top of this brick building, that was a long process, but the image for this was very early in the process, and see this? It's not very developed, but it has this object on top of it. And everybody loved it. And only later came this disaster, this kind of 10 times more expensive, 10 times more longer, and all these things that we got all the shit on our table. Yeah. But it was not, we didn't promise to deliver this project for this or this amount of money. But I think it's an interesting example of something was here like this, and then it was a long process to find its way to before it came out like this.
So, but let's talk about that, because obviously in a case where the image was consumed, it was applauded and it was accepted. So in a way, it precedes the actual process to get it
Absolutely.
done. So
Absolutely.
Tell us about that, because I think that is actually the way of the world in competitions and whatnot. You put something out there, and you don't really know where it's going to take you. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about why did you stick with it, and what of the spark of that idea. I mean, actually, I could imagine there could have been several competing sparks. Yeah. And you chose one, clearly.
Yeah. No. I think a spark never competes. A spark is a spark and destroys everything else. But
so there's a primary, a primal spark.
There's one slide which shows the brick storage building, and then what comes on top or on the side, the tower that was meant to be a commercial element to support the building, the hotel, which is now in this, everything is now included. Somehow we knew that this was going to be the end result, but we nevertheless tested other things, you know. And then that's the one where we were, you know, thinking we could test other things. And then there's another process around how to shape the concert hall. That's this one here, you know, where we had this circular ring and this kind of dynamic, which is almost based on the Greek theater. But we gave it up because this is kind of a stupid form, because if it's too dynamic, you know, it makes you crazy. So we choose something, and that's this model, which I really like, because it's really many times we've been changing this. It has a movement, this kind of spiraling balcony world that goes in one direction, and then the next movement is like this, so it goes in different directions, so that it's dynamic but static at the same time. That was a result of a process. That was not a result of one idea. So this project, because it's so large, obviously has different components of this topic of process versus spark or authorship.
So there's actually a lot I want to go back to, because actually the auditorium space itself, and this is a kind of digression, but maybe I have that right at the moment to have the digression. But I was looking at it and I was studying the image of the interior, and I thought, okay, so there's at first glance you think it's very symmetrical. Maybe like the Sharon's Berlin Philharmonie, like you think of all the precedents that come to mind. But then I realized that if you look at it, it's very willfully asymmetrical, actually. Like this view. This is a great view to see this. So it looks, on first glance, you say, oh, very symmetrical. But then no, it's actually not. And it has a lot of contortion and different levels that sort of, again, and it feels very willful. It feels like this is your will to do this. Yeah. Can you talk about this? Because I'm just wondering, why is there so much contortion, or why is there so much shaping? Why was it necessary in that case?
Yeah, that's a good question. If we didn't have these breaks, so let's say, it would be just balconies wrapping around, like also the classical theaters, or like the Scala, which is great, or the Shakespearean theater, which is symmetrical but also linear, and I think it's more interesting in also in Sharon's building, which we obviously like a lot, that the balconies are nevertheless like separate landscapes, which give you more intimacy. It's more topographical. So that is a decision. We wanted this not to be a stadium, but we wanted this to have the proximity, or the kind of between the viewers and the musician. Something we also want for football arenas. We want the pitch and the people around to be in close relationship. But in a football stadium, it would be stupid to do this kind of separation between the different sectors, So that was obviously something we wanted, but we didn't know exactly how to do it. But it has, as I said, this movement. There's a rationale in this, but I couldn't. We would need to have a floor plan to explain. And then it also has these small ways which connect it. So it has also like a landscape, really, where you move into this building. This is also some of the magic of this kind of encounter, between the people that you see, the little doors, the different entrances, as opposed to a football stadium which has these huge areas where people can come in and go out. If this was a football stadium, it would be a chaos, because there's more aggression in a football stadium than in a concert hall. But it's all related to that kind of questions somehow.
Yeah. Maybe we can turn our attention to the Calder, because actually that is, in a way, so different than the Elbphilharmonie. You mentioned that there was really no site, no budget, no program at the beginning. And so in a case like that, how does the spark emerge? Because there's actually, the resistance is not there in the same way when you're given these kinds of things at the outset.
Well, this is the most unusual project, perhaps, I've ever worked on. And I said because it was during COVID, and I really worked in isolation, and just a small team led by Jason, who is also here, was eventually then my partner. I really needed to know what that could be, and we were selected by the Calder Foundation and by the Barnes Foundation. These two are the client, representing the client, Joe Neubauer and Sandy Rower. Since the first discussions, this was this kind of question around what could that space be for Calder. And Sandy, who is the grandson, he says, you know, he wants this to be the newest and the most innovative and the most unexpected place for Calder, because Calder's work is so well known. It's always exhibited mostly on white plinths, and so we wanted to have a maximum of unlikely and different spaces. But because it didn't have all these restrictions that normally architectural projects have, this is more like an artwork, but not, I'm not saying this is an artwork, but the process, because like the artist, nothing is given, and you have to say, what could that be, you know? And the first drawings, or there was one here, was a totally different approach, was a kind of collection or stack of fragments, like fragments of spaces, spatial fragments that would make this thing. And then I knew that this was never leading to a good, could be nice, but I don't want a nice project, I want a great project. And so we said it should have no form and no color, because that's Calder. It should be everything that Calder is not. That is the fragment approach. That was one of the early sketches. And then because it was COVID, actually I really worked alone a lot and sent sketches that were all stored and tell the story of its making. And it's a lot, every single element that came in was tested, and based on what I said before, do I like it or do I find it stupid after a while? Is it right or not? It's very much based on gesture. What does it actually mean, you know? Does it mean something? Does it make you stop? Or does it feel natural? And it should feel natural. And it's so full of questions of what architecture can be. This one, for instance, you see on the right-hand side, that's the ramped garden, as we called it at the moment, was a kind of a fake nature. That's also an element that comes up a lot, nature and artificial, natural and artificial. And we then replaced it by the vestige garden, this kind of rectangular form, is a fake vestige because there was other neighborhood on that site that we found out after a while, which could give a structure to this part of the garden, as opposed to the previous idea where we faked nature. And I sent Jason images of Tenerife, where we have a house. Tenerife is a volcanic island which has lots of places where you look at, you stand in front and you say to yourself, is this man-made or is this nature? And obviously it's nature, but it looks like a giant had carved it and cut it. It's very fascinating, very fascinating. But it didn't work. I didn't want to do this because it would have looked stupid. So we had to find something else, which is also not form, but is like found. It's like a piece of archaeology or geology, that you mentioned this term of geology. And then as the project evolved, the spaces came along automatically without shaping them, you know. A circle is, of course, also an artificial shape, but the circle is somehow obvious, you know. It's the most generic shape, so it's not really the architecture who says, I do a circle, you know. Well, that kind of thinking is very important. What makes you stop and say, hey, why did the architect do this, you know? It should feel natural and unpretentious. That's the most important. That was driving me, and also the team. By the way, Neda was also working on this project. So the tiny team, you know, one person, and was the team led by Jason, and of course as the project progressed, we knew how to do it, you know. It was basically an underground, it was excavated, it was more space than form. It doesn't have color, but nevertheless, this was an early collage that I did where I thought water could be interesting, but we let it go. You know, there is a lot of process, but each step needed a clear, you know, an idea, a very clear idea. You couldn't say it's natural or it's alternative, but it's really one step excludes a next one, and that's very different from the kind of process that we saw in the Elbphilharmonie. So process, every project is, so to speak, a kind of a process, but this was a different, there's a kind of a logic in it, you know. One step excludes the previous one.
Well, in many ways, one could say, on the one hand, that the Elbphilharmonie is kind of the opposite of the Calder, because, in fact, like their exteriority or the way that they make an iconicity is actually completely different, and maybe the Calder is not at all concerned with that. But what I think is very interesting about both of them is that what they share is a kind of intensity of the interior realm. And in the Calder project, which I think is in many ways the ultimate landform building, the promise of it is it's in a kind of interior landscape that it produces that I think makes it quite special and unique. And in that way, I when I was looking at it, I thought, like, there's actually so much that we don't understand when you look at it from its exterior. So it's quite a surprise, I imagine, entering.
There's some slides that show it from outside. It has this embracing this goal. This thing is, at some point I became aware it's a wall, it's a disc, and it's two gardens. And the garden idea came in later, because obviously if there is no building, there is a lot of land, and there's just this shack that represents the American landscape, and this glass wall, which is just a mirrors the garden. And the older the project will be, I think already this year it will look much nicer, because the garden of Pierre Dolf will become very lush and will transform it into really a garden for the people. And there is very little building, and as you said, it's a lot of space to discover. And every step you walk through this building, you make this encounter, and then you forget the whole process behind it. You know, I also tend to forget it already, because it just, as you walk through it, it should just feel natural, you know, and surprising each time. And it offers for Calder really a place of difference. And the plan there is, of course, that the Calder Foundation changes the objects every few months, you know. So when you go a second time, a year later or 2 years later, you may find something very different, and maybe the same object in a different context, that kind of thing. In that, it is almost an ideal context for a museum. I think a museum should offer to the curators and the artists a wide variety of different places for. If you have a Mona Lisa, you know, you should show it in a mountain shack somewhere, you know, in a stupid wall, and then again in the Louvre, and then maybe here. So it always, great art always, you know, resonates in a different way, and to create different settings is really interesting. And I think Calder's work especially, because it's also moving, you know, Calder's work has this constant movement and this transformative quality more than other 20th century sculpture.
No, I think that's actually one of the other qualities of it, is the temporal aspect of it. The work itself, the Calder work itself, changes and because of its kinetic conditions, and so.
But Calder is not present in this building. He's absent somehow, and I wanted him to be absent so he can, when he's in there, so he can shine more, he can be more powerful, you know. There's always a danger that you do something for someone or something, and you mimic this person or this whatever. I think that's how architects inspire themselves. That's what I really hate about architecture, if it does that. Because it doesn't lead to anything, you know. It's like someone follows you with a shadow. And that's, a lot of our work has that kind of fear of, that kind of pretentiousness, or this kind of simulacrum. That's something I want to avoid always.
Before we actually open it up to allow students to ask questions, I do have one other question that I thought would maybe encapsulate some of the things that we've been seeing today in this fascinating conversation with you. About 7 years ago, in this room, we had an event, and Mosen ran it. It was called How Will Architecture Be Conceived? In that event, Peter Eisenman, Harry Cobb, and Rafael Moneo came together to speak about this kind of enduring question of how architecture will be, how can it be conceived? And of course, this is a 2-hour talk, so I cannot condense it here, but I think what's so interesting is that Cobb, in his way, set out to describe 3 moral imperatives that he felt are the most important in architecture as the basis of architecture's direction. Moneo spoke about the way in which we can see the present and future through the past, and was very interested in history and the role of history in architecture. And Eisenman said that architecture is really no longer about this debate, certainly not about the debate between modernism and postmodernism. That's not what we're talking about anymore. And if it's not about that, then perhaps it's about abstraction or phenomena, abstraction versus phenomena. And then, because Eisenman is Eisenman, decided to pick on Cobb and Moneo and said, Cobb, you are abstraction. Moneo, you are phenomena. And so there's an interesting dialectic that is occurring here. And I was thinking to myself, where is Jacques Herzog on the spectrum between abstraction and phenomena? Is it possible?
It's up to you to say. I'm not interested. I'm really not interested in that kind of questions. I think it's...
Okay, could I answer then? Because I, you know, in a way, I think the other thing in your Pritzker laureate speech, you talked about actually not wanting to be classified. And in fact, to me, the reason that this is interesting is because I actually think you do both. To me, your work is actually a kind of, you refuse to be in any single lane. And I like the fact that I think that it's immensely pleasurable to see you moving between the different realms of intellection on the one hand and phenomena on the other. And I think this is a very powerful idea. So if I were to say, you know, where you are or what motivates you, I mean, we started talking early about the feeling of the kind of feeling that one receives in, like, the Ricola, for example. So that would lend itself to phenomena. At the same time, your Prada Aoyama project is very much, it has a kind of intellectualization that deals with how one deals with the shed. So I do think that in a way you meander between these poles in a very productive way.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a very, let's say, conceptual approach to things. That's why I tend to avoid everything rather than say, I want to do it this way, you know, like a sculptor who starts, he's somewhere he starts to shape things. I'm more hesitant. But the mind is constantly thinking of things, so the mind also is shaping things, so we shouldn't be naive and believe we can escape everything. But so the conceptual, intellectual reflection behind things is very important. But who cares? You know, I mean, a building, I mean, Eisenman, many others, you know, thinkers and theoretical think this is all for nothing, you know, because at the end of the day, you see a building anywhere in the world, whether it's famous or not, you know, you pass by and for some reason it touches you. You like to see it more. You like it for its anonymous quality or for its beauty or for whatever. I think architecture just needs to work, you know, and not disturb you. That's the least it should do. But many projects just make you crazy and angry because they are so pretentious, because people have thought, and because they want their thoughts and their ideas to be expressed and to believe in this rather than that. I really don't like that. That's why I keep saying to Peter, we've been talking many times, he believes books are important. And I said there's not one single text about architecture, historical architecture, which still plays a role today. Unfortunately, students still have to study and read all this bullshit. But it's for nothing. It's for nothing. It doesn't tell you in any way what you should do today. It doesn't. You're alone. You need to make buildings great, you know? And the text and influences of any theoretical person, Corbusier, laws we have mentioned, this is all dead. It's dead. But buildings are here. Make buildings right. That's what I can say.
Okay.
But it's not so easy, of course.
Yeah. Clearly, okay. I would love a couple of students to have the chance to ask questions. You've been waiting a long time. Please, actually, any others at the same time. We're going to invite you to the table. Now we're going to pretend, again, nobody's here. It's just the three of us. Maybe if there's someone else who would like to. Please, introduce yourself.
My name's Miles, and I'm an MArch1 here at the GSD. And yeah, my question for you is, I guess, I mean, maybe in rejection of certain theoretical texts as influence, but I'm interested in, well, over the course of many years, you have a large body of work, and you kind of have your own history to contend with. On the other hand, you seem very adamant in architecture's specificity. Each project has a certain specificity, and that's generative. But I'm curious how you navigate that specificity with relation to your own history and what you've already made. You know, not inventing the wheel every time, or are you reinventing the wheel every time? I'm curious that relation, because there's, you know, I have no idea what it's like to have hundreds of built projects.
Yeah. I think it's a good question. We indeed try to look at each project differently. And I don't want to make them be different, but they ask for a different answer each time. And the person I am now is different from the person that I was when we did the Ricola building in the 80s. And I couldn't do this anymore, even if I wanted to do it again. So obviously, I'm a different person. And for me, the question is not so much how can you do each building in such a different way. The question for me would rather be how can you do buildings with the same style or with a certain style. That's also something I become an allergic reaction. When I see this kind of style that follows people, this is also one of these ghosts that I'm scared of. So obviously it's different. Is it each time good? Is it each time really new? Is it each time really different? Or does some things obviously coming back because this is architecture, and there are some laws about like gravity, so there are obviously things that are here, but there are enough, I say that again about cooking, ingredients on the table in architecture, material, the site is different, the weather is different, the age is different, the people are different. So the diversity of the difference is rather something I accept as something natural and inspiring than it would be if I had to follow a path. I would not do architecture anymore, probably.
I mean, I guess just follow up. I mean, you also were adamant in such a large archive of, keeping the things that you've made. I mean, do you go? Of course, Jacques today is different than the Jacques that spoke here 10 years ago. But do you go down to your own Schaulager of types?
No.
It's there. But
I am a living archive. That's already spooky, So this is because I have done so many things, but I think I know them less good than many others, because I really am not so interested in what I have done, honestly. I'm more interested, I live now, and I'm much more interested, and it's obviously unavoidable to go back every once in a while. And if you go back, you don't want to see something stupid, And when I say that, I mean it. I think I have to be very honest with what I do and what we do as a company. So I don't find traces of pretentiousness or things where we tried to pretend it's our impulse, but it somehow comes from another influence. This is something I really want to exclude. That's why I do the kind of work I do. So the work of every architect explains this person's psychological structure. Architecture is very psychological. You cannot escape it. If you start doing buildings, you will recognize yourself, and you don't want to be. It's again this kind of spooky impression that you have if you see something and you don't like it anymore, because you see this is a stupid guy who did this building. If you go back 5-10 years ago, later, that's very special about architecture, and this is something you only experience after a while, because you have to do a few things first. And if they are naive, if they are not so experienced what you do, that's okay. But please avoid this kind of lack of honesty. Not in a moral sense, but in a sense that just try to do what you think is really right, and do it together with the client. That's also something where I disagree with Eisenman. He believes that you should do things behind the back of the client. I think that's a wrong idea.
Okay, let's. Thank you so much. Another question.
Yeah, thank you, Jacques. My question is, my name is Horacio. I'm an MR2 student. I want to know about your relationship to academia, right? And how you see how and why you got involved to academia, and how you see academia still being relevant as in the intellectual production of knowledge. Because some offices, some practices use the academic space as an extension of their office production. Maybe some use it as a research laboratory. So I'm curious to understand what was your approach to academia when you were involved?
Well, exactly that. I mean, we've been teaching our whole life. I mean, here we really like to come because it's very inspiring. It's very different, My first teaching experience was in Cornell. That was a disaster, honestly, because I really didn't like that context, and I was a totally unknown young architect, so they didn't understand how genius I am, That was also difficult. So, but once you have enough self-assurance, you can be a good teacher. And we learned. I always use teaching to learn from people, from students, and that's why I also like this format, Grace. That I'm so glad you do this, because when you can speak to people, you hear back from them, like what you're going to ask me. What is their thinking? What is their and obviously, also, we did a lot of territorial studies. You're just many people, many eyes. We go to places, again, that we didn't know, where we didn't go with a specific methodology. So we back to this question of theory. The methodology we applied was perception. Just watch and describe what you see. So very much of our academic life was very much incorporated in the work of our company. And somehow we still have this kind of academic practice inside our company, even if we don't work with students anymore, but we've done that for many decades. And now younger partners will continue this. As you know, Jason and Christine will teach a semester in this fall. And I think it's also great, that's also very selfish, but it's great to discover talents and to have them come join our company, like Jason. You know, he's a senior partner, was the greatest student ever here in Harvard, for me at least.
A plug. Okay, please.
Okay, hi, thank you so much, both of you, for the presentation. My name is Claudia. I'm from the Master of Architecture program, and what I wanted to ask is if theoretical literature is dead. I feel like that's a lot of what we get here at the GSD, and it's kind of the same question from the different side. Like, as students, what should we look to get out of our education? And not necessarily in our free time, like traveling, seeing architecture, like as students, what should be our focus to get out of this?
I'm not good in giving advices, but I think I always liked to just watch the world. And
In studio.
Sorry?
In studio. Be in studio to watch the world.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, but I think anything could be interesting. And I think what comes from your own perception, if you discover something every day, you know, something that touches you, that, you know, is something that makes you richer and makes you want to do something. And I was, you know, I grew up in Basel in Switzerland, and we don't have a huge architectural tradition. You know, we are like the French are diving into a rich history of architecture, Baroque and Classicism, the Italians, and you know, and also America has amazing, let's say, tradition of wood construction and high rise between these two things. So you're much more how do you say, have something in the back that might be your culture. Switzerland has a more rural culture, doesn't have a very urban culture, doesn't have something that is very Swiss, let's say. So I liked what I saw because it was just my surrounding. It has more anonymous qualities. You know, I liked in the 1930s, the Bauhaus style thing, I liked the B side more. It's like if you have a disc, you know, there's an A in the B side. Very often the B side was more inspiring. So, you know, I'm just saying this was my approach. Your approach will be different. But I think it comes more from what you discover on your own rather than what schools tell you. Schools that have a logic, or like Colin Rowe was an inspiration in Cornell. I think a very bad influence, but I mean all these teachers who have influences at some point, it's good if you are under such an influence as a student, but that you give it. You reject it after a while. It's good because it pushes you into something, and you have certainly some influences here. You have professors from all over the world, so some may have enough charisma to keep you going. I think that's important. You should accept that. But you should know that ultimately it doesn't help you find your own way. It just helps you to get more energy. You should be seduced by a teacher. You know, and great teachers have this seductive quality. I was under the influence of Aldo Rossi, very good-looking man, very elegant. No, I mean it, you know. And he was, and the way he was speaking. So let yourself be seduced by that. But then you should find out that this is just, you know, one possibility. Your possibility, your own, is much more interesting. But you have to find it. But I cannot. Not everybody can do this, of course, you know. So it's a bad advice, maybe.
That's great advice.
Please.
Thank you for that. My name is Livia. I also study architecture. And I've noticed in the way that you describe so much of the work, you talk about intuition and experience of the body, the immediate affect. But also you build things that a lot of people work on that require big teams and coordination and many people that are able to come together and do small parts to one end. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think about this relationship between what is individual and what needs to be collaborative and collective.
Well, I think that's a very good question, but it's a bit like a film. I mean, I like the movie is over, then you see all these endless names, and each has a certain role in the whole process. I mentioned that today, I think, during the talk, you know, that there is sometimes, I'm not so close to every single project. You know, we have very large projects, so there are many teams. Sometimes I tend to forget. I come in, I have a very strong conceptual narrative, and, you know, I'm involved very much. But then the project evolves, and I come in later at some point. But there are so many details that have to be done and fine-tuned, and only when it's finished you see what is there, and you recognize something, but there are other things you don't recognize, and it makes you happy to see that things are done well, which you cannot control, because architecture is so big, you can never control everything, you know, except for, let's say, the Calder is fully controlled, I would say, or almost fully controlled. So yes, the kind of thing that allows you to make this control in a way that it really makes the building even nicer, because when things are really carefully done, and this careful moment in the architecture cannot come from one only person, you know, this must come from a whole team.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm an MArch 1. I'm curious what you said about aging and that architecture reflects the time in which it was built. And with the Reclo project, you said the Blossfeld images. So you have these plants that have been dead for 100 years on the facade, and then you say as it aged, you notice the moss. Versus the M+ project, you talk about this kind of archaeological feel and how there's this almost kind of mood now that museums have to feel like they've been there, that they're industrial, that, you know, they're occupying these buildings. Is that, how do you view aging in older projects like the Reclo now? Will the M+ have the moss, or is it different that we're kind of almost pre-aging certain parts because that's, you know, where it is?
Well, not every project has the same potential to do this, you know. In the M+ is rather the opposite, because you have these kind of tiles, ceramic tiles, which are very resistant, you know, they resist aging, or they resist, so it has a kind of perfection towards the outside, which is in line with this idea of the screen, you know. The screen cannot have traces of aging, you know. But the technology will change and transform. Maybe it will not work anymore. There is no electricity anymore, so it fades away. But not everything I said applies for every single project. You cannot do everything in every project. I think that's also an important lesson, that we cannot pack too much into one thing, because you have to prioritize some aspects to make it really strong, to give it a character. I think it's important that buildings have a character, have a specific quality. That's maybe what I mean by character.
Hi, Jacques. Hi, Grace. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more after this, so please
Okay.
introduce yourself.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, no. Welcome. Join us.
Okay. My name is Frank. I'm actually a undergrad from Rhode Island School of Design, not Harvard. My question would be, I went to high school in Miami and I went to the Press Museum, the 1111 Lincoln. What I noticed in your firm's design in general is like not only they come with great designs, but also great details in execution of the building and construction. And I want to know, or ask you this question about, what do you see as why is it important to have a project be developed well in the detail level and in construction, and how, as a global firm, how do you control that aspect in the global landscape?
Well, there is not a general answer to this, but I think it's obviously better if a project has a careful, is carefully done, executed. If you imagine the opposite, I mean, you mentioned the 1111, I think that's a very good example, that it pays back. It's just more, it also survives better, I think it's very important that buildings are well detailed, and also this issue of time that, affects buildings. It's nice to see traces of rain and moss, but only in places that you want them to be, but not everywhere, not in the kitchen, for instance. So, yes, but it could be, but the notion of carefully detailed, details must be intelligent. They shouldn't be for the sake of being a detail, I think I like architecture which is not full of details that jump in your face, Otherwise it's pretentious. So, yes, it should be careful because it feels better. Then if it feels better, people are more seduced, more attracted. They maintain a building better, so it survives more and it's more sustainable. It's a whole sequence of logical consequences. And I think this idea, we didn't speak about this, Grace, but I think how do buildings survive, and which buildings survive, and what's the role of preservation and all these things? That's another topic that's very dear to me, and but maybe we do a second round sometime when I'm a bit older.
Okay, I'll be very brief. So I want to talk about the impact on the students we're now cohort. For example, the role of representations. For example, what all the publications of the book, and the way you deliver, and also how do you print your buildings in exhibition in a bigger scales with invitation with artists. So, for example, your representation of the plan or section would always have a black relationship with white, negative and positive space. What do you want to try to convey to us as a students? Because you said you're trying to inspire us through all the great portfolio that you've been doing. What are you trying to convey to us in your publication, your exhibition, and your on top of the amazing buildings you do?
Well, publications are there. Originally, they were, I think, to a kind of a PR instrument for architects, but now we are old enough to not do it for this anymore, so we do it really for you to understand it better, and the black and white helps you to read plans a bit better. I mean, you are a professional, so you could read them also if they didn't have that. But many, if you just flip through, obviously if you have this kind of negative, positive graphics, it's more easy to read. And I think we have grown quite a bit in doing publications in an unpretentious way, and that makes it easy for people to understand and to grasp the most important elements of a design. That's the only thing I could say. There's no other hidden trick behind it.
Yeah, and also about the impact, let's say the recent building about the social housing in New York. Do you also consider this impact to greater community, for example, different clients, different users, on top of, let's say, the artist involvement in M+?
Oh, I think that's a good point. This project that you mentioned is a project we recently won, and I think it's important that architects who have a certain reputation and quality are being asked to do such kind of projects and not just commercial projects. And there's less and less, let's say, space for design in inexpensive housing and social housing, especially. Whereas, in fact, this would be one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting field, But there is little money in this field, but gladly there was an opportunity in New York to do this project. Yes, this is something we would like to do more.
Yeah.
Great, great. Okay, we have time for one last one, and I'm sorry we're going over time, but this is fascinating. Please.
Hi, thank you for your time. My name is Josh Mo, and I'm a junior from the Rhode Island School of Design as well. I'm here on behalf of my studio teammates, whom I've collaborated on working on this conceptual model for the Elbphilharmonie. And my question can pertain to the Elbphilharmonie, or it doesn't have to be, but we were wondering, what was the biggest change that occurs or occurred at the precipice of the design phase and the execution phase of Elbphilharmonie or any of your other buildings? And how do you either welcome that change, or do you have to reconcile with that change?
When change is being imposed on you as an architect, that's what you want to know. I actually like if we have to change, but sometimes you have to change because of money, lacking resources. Sometimes you have to change because the client doesn't like it, so it's not always pleasant. But we could also do a lecture talking about changes, and the most famous, perhaps, project that is resulting from a change is the museum in New York and the parish. The parish was in the financial crisis, hit by the financial crisis, and we had to give up the original concept, which I would have loved to build, which was a composition of different, unlikely composition and combination of different studios by artists, and really replicating their studios in an abstract way, just in wood, but the space and the light, where the light came in, was exactly replicating the studios, and this would make for an amazing set of galleries. And we couldn't do this anymore because there was no money, so we had a radical change and started from scratch, because it's always a possibility to reinvent something and to start again. And if you like to start again, you're not obsessed sticking to the same thing only, and sometimes you do this better and sometimes less. Then it resulted in this very linear shed kind of building, which is came out very successfully as a very nice building. So, yeah, it's an opportunity. If you then just do it because you have to change it, and you just change what you have to change, then it rarely comes out well.
Thank you very much.
Jacques, thank you so much for your time, and we will have that second conversation.